Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with something a little more exciting. The dirty, gaslight world of Victorian London, a city of grand ambition, industrial wonder and terrible poverty. This is not Sherlock Holmes' London or Queen Victoria's palace garden parties. This is the London of smog, filth and stench, a place where surviving the day is a small miracle. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. You open your eyes, and the first thing you see is your brother's feet, inches from your face, dirty and twitching slightly from some terrible dream. Welcome to your only room. This is not a bedroom. This is not a living room. This is your room, and everything. You share it with 6 other souls, a bed, 2 chairs of questionable structural integrity, and a rat that has been here so long you're considering charging it rent. There's no wallpaper, just patches of wall where something used to be. A painting, a photograph, a glimmer of hope. The ceiling leaks when it rains, and even when it doesn't, it drips something you decide not to investigate. The fireplace is fake. There it lay, like a cruel joke. A square, decorated to look real, with no wood, no fire, no heat. In winter, the cold seeped through the straw, through the clothes, and gnawed at the bones. Outside, it was freezing. Inside, it was no better. You could shiver with your own breath. The bed was a pile of dry straw, 2 feet thick, untidy and musty. It had been a mattress, a nest, a shelter for you and for any creature small enough to crawl in. Mice were your companions. Fleas were your bedfellows, and sometimes a chicken. No one knew whose, but it found a place to stay. Every night, sleep was a bargain. You bargained with your body that if it would keep quiet about the itch, the cold, the dirt, you wouldn't mind the gnawing in your ears. You bargained with yourself that tomorrow would be better. But the next morning, you wake up with someone's foot on your face. There's a bucket in the corner. The bucket is more than just a thing. It's a symbol of resignation. It's a toilet, a bathtub, an all-purpose water source. For all the purposes you don't want to put into words. There's no lid, there's no partition, and no privacy. You squat down next to the person eating the porridge and call it morning. The air in the room is thick with the smell of mold, old trash, and people. Every footstep is a creaking floorboard, a sound you'll remember forever, because it's like the groan of the house itself trying to hold on to its last shreds of dignity. The blankets are thin, dirty, and smelly. The pillow, if you're lucky, is a straw bag, stuffed with anything soft and useless. An old sock, a rag, some dry trash. You think a window is a place to let light in? No, it's where the sounds come from. Hawkers coughing, arguing, someone cursing their life. You open the window and you see only a grayish-brown alley, littered with garbage, animal feces, and dried blood from the nearby slaughterhouse. A butcher throws leftover bones down the drain, and an old woman raises goats by the back door. The window is essentially a picture frame of despair. You sit on one of the 2 chairs, but you never dare lean back, because it could break at any moment. The chair is not for resting, only for temporarily not touching the floor. The table is tilted, and everything in the room is like the people here. Temporarily standing, temporarily living, temporarily existing. If you've ever seen a small modern apartment and complained about the lack of a balcony, imagine living in a room where the balcony is imaginary. The bathroom is a bucket, the bed is straw, the window is a hellish mat, and the only warmth comes from a mouse lying on your chest in the middle of the night. This house is not a home. It is a wooden box that is about to collapse. A cage. Prison without guards. Because you can't escape. And you are not special. Thousands of other people live like this. Thousands of children grow up in conditions like this, learning to sleep without breathing, learning not to look at anyone when using a bucket, learning to survive without expecting anything comfortable. If the room you just left was a cramped nightmare, then outside is an expanded version. A nightmare with wheels, fog, and the smell of a city drowning in its own excrement. You open the rickety wooden door, step 1 foot outside, and are instantly swallowed by what you call air. Not air as you know it. Not fresh, not cool. Unbreathable. It's thick, slimy, and smells like a wet sock that's been stuffed into someone's mouth and thrown onto the radiator. It's past super fog. Not only does it obscure your vision, it fills your lungs with a pungent mix of coal smoke, sewage, and floating mold. You can't see your hand if you hold it out in front of you. You're not even sure what's coming from up ahead. A lamppost? An oncoming carriage? A man trying to sell moldy bread? None of it is certain. All you know is that every step is a gamble. You try to step onto the sidewalk, only to find that it's either too narrow to fit your whole foot on, or too cracked to be real ground, or there's no sidewalk at all. You and hundreds of others are forced to share the road with heavy horse-drawn carts. The clatter of iron hooves against stone creating a rhythm not of life but of a long funeral march. A cart zooms by, its wooden tires slashing the mud, splashing a mysterious gray-brown stain onto your feet. All you know is that it's not clean water. Could be rain or gutter water or something that was cabbage soup a week ago. Every step is a never-ending crime scene investigation. One small mistake, a slip, a misstep, could send you face first into a thick puddle that's half mud, a quarter horse manure, and the rest you don't want to know about. In the middle of the street is a sewer, in theory. In reality, it is a miniature river that flows endlessly, carrying scraps of meat from the slaughterhouse, withered vegetables, old shoes, ashes from the fireplace, and dead rats. You see a child trying to jump over it, his feet not reaching, falling in, soaked from head to toe, standing up with eyes that no longer believe in humanity. To cross the sewer, you need the grace of a circus performer and shoes taller than your self-esteem. Otherwise, you need a long stick, a daring leap, or a prayer. The air is thick with smells that should not coexist. Unburnt coal smoke, fresh sewer gas, the smell of boiled meat from the shop at the beginning of the alley, and overcooked cabbage from last night. Add to that the smell of sweat from passers-by, horse manure, damp leather, and sometimes the smell of a corpse dumped in the alley. If there were a perfume that represented the times, it might be called urban misery. The smell does not leave when you get home. It clings to your hair, your clothes, even the slices of bread in your pocket, as if the air itself has signed a contract to become part of your body. You look up, if you have the courage, and see the dim light of the street lamps, which have been turned on early but do nothing but turn everything into long, wavering shadows in the mist. People move about in a literal and figurative blur. A woman shoves you, thinking you are a thief. A child cries because she has lost her mother just a few meters away. An old man groans after falling because he cannot see the steps. Every sound is louder in the mist. The sound of horses' hooves, the shouts, the quarrels, the collisions, as if the whole city is trying to shout at you. Go back to your room. At least there are well-behaved rats there. You can't blame anyone. People are used to it. They move silently through the fog like ghosts, avoiding each other by instinct, surviving by habit. No one asks questions. No one stops. No one says, maybe we shouldn't live like this, because no one has a choice. If you're wondering, why don't they wait until the sky clears before going out? You clearly don't live here. Here, the sky clears is a myth, like fresh butter or warm clothes. Every day is like this, and everyone has to keep going. And that's when you understand that if the house is a personal hell, the street is a public battlefield, where you don't know whether the enemy is the fog, the carriage, the horse manure, or the blindness of a system that is silently collapsing. But you have to go, because you have a job. You have a responsibility. You have a life you didn't choose, but you have to live it, and survive at any cost. You've barely survived the streets, damp, cold, and stinking like a raccoon that lost a bar fight. And now, as your bones shiver and your stomach echoes, you wonder, is there breakfast? It's a word that, in theory, promises hope. In practice, that hope died last winter. This is not the full English. There's no plate with eggs, no rashers of bacon, no buttered toast stacked like soft pillows. Here, in this part of the world, in this part of the century, breakfast is a punchline, a cruel joke with dry bread as its setup. You stare down at a crust so rigid it might once have been part of a roof tile. You chew, and your teeth ask if this was truly necessary. Maybe there's porridge, if the rats didn't get to the oats first. It arrives pale, gray, slightly sour, and always cold. The closest thing to luxury in front of you is a mug of tea. But this is not tea in the way a London cafe serves it with a dash of milk and 2 sugars. This is survival in liquid form. It's not brewed for taste or comfort. It's brewed because boiled water doesn't kill you. That's it. That's the bar. Does it kill me? If not, cheers. In a world where unboiled water is basically medieval biological warfare, tea is the sanitized mercy of the morning. No one is sipping it on a veranda. No one is steeping their leaves for flavor notes. It's hot. It's clean. And if you're lucky, it won't bring a fever. That's not preference. That's strategy. Now, suppose you fancy milk. Adorable. Maybe someone sold you a jar from a tin pail. Maybe it looks fine. Maybe it even smells fresh. But here's a twist. It's been preserved with formaldehyde. Yes, the same stuff used to embalm corpses. One sip and you're playing Russian roulette with your intestines. Sugar? That's adorable too. Each spoonful costs more than your rent. Butter? That's something you hear about in church stories. Jam? A fantasy. Only real if some rich aunt you never met dies and leaves you a half-open jar in her will. But that's your breakfast. That's what stands between you and the rest of your day. And just when your stomach begins to accept its cruel fate, you smell it. The bakery across the alley, run by someone who wears a hat and probably owns silverware. Their ovens hum like distant heaven. Bread so fresh it exhales when sliced. But you don't get any. That's not your breakfast. That's the breakfast of someone whose name is etched into glass. Someone with a doorbell. Someone who doesn't eat standing up. You keep walking, because stopping to imagine what fresh bread tastes like is a dangerous game. Across the street, a line forms outside the poorhouse. No one speaks. They're cold, wet, resigned. Widows, orphans, men with eyes like faded ink. They wait not for hope, but for gruel. Gray, sloppy, barely food. It's warm, someone says, as if that's enough. It's edible, they add, as if warmth and edibility have become luxuries. And maybe they have. Breakfast here is not about starting your day. It's about proving you lived through the night. Hunger isn't an event. It's a setting. A quiet, constant ache behind your ribs. You don't fight it anymore, you adjust. You lower your expectations like drawing a curtain. If you're lucky, today's curtain comes with crumbs. If you're not, it's just air. No toast, no jam, no Instagrammable plates. Just crumbs and liquid heat, served with the silence of people who've learned not to ask for more. You wake up not because you're ready, but because the day doesn't care. There's no mercy in the morning, no gentle easing in. Just the gray light, the cold air, and the knowledge that you're already late for something. For many in Victorian Britain, the concept of earning a living wasn't poetic, it was brutal arithmetic. Work meant survival, but survival didn't mean living. It meant enduring. The jobs? Back-breaking, soul-crushing, body-consuming. You could end up in a factory where the roar of machines never stops and the air is thick with soot and metallic dust. Or maybe you're on the docks, hauling crates heavier than your own body. Or in a brickyard, stacking until your joints scream. These jobs didn't require skill as much as sacrifice. You gave your youth, your spine, your lungs, and in return you bought another day of food. If you were lucky, no one asked how long a person should work. The answer was, as long as there's daylight and sometimes longer. 12, 14, 16 hours. 6 days a week. No paid breaks, no sick days, no vacation. Illness didn't mean rest, it meant risk. If you missed a shift, you could lose your job. And with 20 others willing to replace you for half the wage, no one waited or cared. A cough might be the beginning of the end. A limp could be a death sentence. There was no room for weakness in a system built to ignore humanity. And the workplace? A minefield. Machines spun and slammed with no guards or warnings. Fingers vanished. Arms were crushed. A single mistake could mean a lifetime of maimed regret. Protective gear didn't exist. And if it did, you couldn't afford it. The air itself could be dangerous, loaded with fibers, soot, or toxic fumes. Inhaling it for a decade was like swallowing your grave one breath at a time. If the factories were mechanical beasts, then women were the invisible scaffolding holding the entire system upright. They cooked, cleaned, sewed, scrubbed, laundered, ironed, and served without pause, without thanks. They worked just as long, often harder, and were paid far less. Many weren't paid at all. Domestic workers were expected to live in silence and servitude. The job included long hours, constant labor, and an unspoken agreement. Your safety is not guaranteed. Abuse wasn't a scandal, it was routine. To complain was to be dismissed. To endure was the only option. The line between duty and labor blurred until it vanished. A woman could rise before dawn, clean for 10 hours, care for children that weren't hers, wash the linens, cook the dinner, take verbal beatings, and still be told she didn't do enough. Rest was not hers to claim. Even sitting was sometimes forbidden. Her labor wasn't recognized as real work, only as obligation. And the world accepted that lie without flinching. And no, working hard didn't lift you out of poverty. That's a myth, maybe the cruelest one of all. You could work yourself to the bone and still not make enough to eat well. Still not have shoes that fit. Still not escape the slum you were born into. Labor didn't lead to wealth. It led to exhaustion. The paycheck wasn't a ladder, it was a leash. A few coins to keep you from collapsing, but never enough to let you climb out. People died on the job. People died because of the job. And when they did, their names weren't written down. Their lives weren't mourned by newspapers. They simply vanished, like dust swept from a factory floor. To be clear, the system didn't fail. It did exactly what it was designed to do: extract. Treated humans like fuel. Burned them down until there was nothing left but ashes and silence. And when one burned out, another took their place. The factory didn't care if you were kind, or clever, or desperate. It just cared that you showed up, that your body still moved, that your hands could still hold tools or bricks or levers. When you stopped functioning, you stopped existing. And still, people kept going. Not because they believed in the system, not because they had hope, but because someone needed them to keep going. A child at home, a sick mother, a younger sibling, because what choice did they have? Sometimes they dreamed of something more: a garden, quiet day, a job that didn't hurt. But dreams didn't feed you, so they woke up, they worked, they collapsed into sleep. Then they did it again, and again, until the days blurred and the years passed and the toll became permanent. Labor was supposed to be honorable, but in truth it was punishment, for being poor, for being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a sentence handed down by an invisible judge with no appeal. No matter how hard you tried, you couldn't escape. The wheel kept turning, and you just kept walking inside it. And for women, for the invisible workers, for the children who carried water or picked threads until their fingers bled, the silence was worse than the suffering. No one thanked them, no one saved them. They just faded, exhausted, unnamed, unremembered. So yes, the work was real, the pain was real, the contribution was real, but the reward, that was the lie. Because in Victorian Britain, work didn't set you free. It simply reminded you that freedom was never meant for people like you. Childhood in this world is not a sacred phase. It's not a playground of joy, nor a classroom of imagination. It's a workforce, a reservoir of tiny bodies to be put to use. There are no toys here, no schools, no stories before bed, only work. If you're 5 years old and small enough to crawl into a chimney flue, congratulations, you just qualified for employment. There's no celebration, no cake, just soot and scars. One of your first jobs might be chimney sweeping. It sounds simple until you realize you are the broom. Shirtless and barefoot, you crawl through the narrowest, darkest shafts, scraping soot with your fingers, coughing it into your lungs. If you get stuck, they don't pull you out, they push you harder with a stick from below. If you die, you're replaced, not mourned. Or maybe you're outside on a corner selling matches. It's not the cold that kills you, it's the phosphorus. The white dust clings to your skin, seeps into your jaw. Eventually, your teeth fall out. Then your bones rot. They call it phossy jaw, like it's a character in a nursery rhyme instead of a death sentence. You might be a scavenger, digging through dockside sludge for bits of rope or scrap metal. The mud is dark and toxic, but you wade in anyway. No one's giving you gloves. You're lucky if you still have shoes. Or maybe you don't need shoes because the job is indoors. A factory. Finally, a roof. But not safety. You are not there to play or watch. You are there to clean under machines that never stop moving. No one turns them off for you. You are small enough to crawl beneath the belts and wheels. And when the spinning blades catch your sleeve, or your hair, or your arm, they don't stop. They shred. And when you scream, the overseer yells louder, "Replace him." This is not an exception. This is how the system runs. Children are cheap. Children don't strike. Children don't demand breaks. They take a few pennies and say thank you because they're afraid not to. You might think they at least get to keep what they earn. Not really. A few coins a day, and most of that goes to food, which isn't enough food. And if they miss a day because they're sick or weak or injured, they don't eat at all. Rest is not a right. Rest is a luxury for people who don't starve. Children here don't get to say, "I'm tired." They get to say, "I'm next." And what about school? What about learning? That's a privilege, not a right. If your parents loved you enough and were rich enough, you might go until age 6. After that, the streets teach you. You learn fast or you vanish. You learn how to ask for work without making eye contact. You learn which streets are safe at night. You learn how not to cry when your fingers freeze. You learn how to run. Faster than a man with a whip or a cart rolling downhill or another kid who wants your spot. A child in this world looks like this. Bare feet, coughing into a threadbare coat, selling newspapers in the rain. Not because they read them, but because it's the only thing that keeps them upright. They get pushed, shouted at, sometimes trampled by horses. They flinch at kindness because it's rare. They flinch at everything else because it's expected. What do they dream of? Working in a factory, not to get rich, not to become free, but because it's indoors, because the hours are regular, because you might get a meal. That's the bar. That's the ceiling. And the adults? They know. They see it. They walk past. Some even sigh, "Poor child." But then they buy the matches. They light their fires. They read the newspapers. The child disappears back into the blur of smog and soot. Unnoticed. Unnamed. They don't get statues. They don't get books written about them. They get buried in paupers' graves and replaced by other barefoot children who were watching. So no, there is no childhood here. Just labor. And the terrifying question. If your child was hungry, and the only way to feed them was to send them into the dark, would you? The cruelest part? You wouldn't even have a choice. She wakes up before the sun, not because she wants to, but because someone else decided she should. Her feet hit the cold floor of the attic, if you can call it a floor. It's damp, drafty, and full of spiders. There's no insulation, no warmth, and no privacy. Just a thin blanket and a reminder. You're the help, and the help doesn't rest. By the time the rest of the house yawns and stretches, she's already scrubbed the floors, carried up coal for the fireplaces, polished the grates until her fingers ache, and begun ironing clothes she'll never wear. She eats last. She wears hand-me-downs. She doesn't sit unless told. And she must always smile, especially if someone crosses the line. If her employer is cruel, she must be grateful. If he's inappropriate, she must pretend not to notice. Anything else is grounds for dismissal. No one thanks her, no one sees her, and no one remembers her name. Being a servant was the best-case scenario for many women in the Victorian age. If she wasn't lucky enough to be employed in a household, she might be married, which, back then, meant a different kind of servitude with no wage, no recognition, and no end. As a wife and a mother, she still worked before dawn and after dusk. She cooked, she cleaned, she washed, sewed, patched, folded, fetched, and somehow stretched 3 shillings into food for 5. She cared for the children, the sick, the elderly, the husband. She managed the home like a business without any of the authority. If she got tired, she didn't say it. If she got sick, she didn't show it. And if she had dreams, she forgot them. Work outside the home wasn't better. It was just bloodier. If she washed clothes for a living, her hands cracked open from the scalding water and harsh soap. The skin would bleed, but the laundry had to be spotless. If she sewed, she sat for hours in silence, hunched over needle and thread by the dimmest candlelight. The pay was pitiful, and if she accidentally pricked a finger and stained the fabric, she was fired. Some women made matches. That meant handling white phosphorus. Harmless until it wasn't. The exposure began with toothaches, then abscesses, then the jawbone itself rotted away. The face collapsed. The smell was unbearable. The pain unimaginable. Employers dismissed it casually. She probably chewed gum. The truth was uglier. The system didn't care. And when all else failed, when there was no factory, no laundry, no sewing job left, some women turned to what society refused to name: sex work. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe. But it paid sometimes. Enough for food, or a room for the night, or a pair of wool gloves to keep frostbite away. The risk? Everything. Arrest, assault, disease, disappearance. No protection. No mercy. Just shame from the very society that left her no other path. Morality didn't spare her. Judged her. Women were expected to be silent, modest, obedient, and endlessly productive. Even when there was no floor beneath their feet, no fire in the hearth, no future on the horizon. The world demanded virtue without offering survival. There were no maternity leaves, no social safety nets, no laws that said a woman shouldn't be worked to death or beaten into silence. There was only the expectation that she keep going, that she endure. And yet, through all of it, women endured. They held babies to their chests with soot-covered hands. They cleaned houses that would never be their own. They tore their bodies apart for pennies, and then gave those pennies to others. They shared food when they barely had enough. They whispered comfort to crying children. They wiped tears with sleeves already wet from scrubbing. They were not celebrated, but they were strong. They were not protected, but they protected others. They bore burdens without being asked, and without being thanked. In history books, they're rarely mentioned, but they were there in every street, every tenement, every factory floor, holding everything together while everything else tried to break them. This chapter is not about weakness. It's about a kind of quiet, relentless strength that refuses to die, even when the world seems designed to crush it. It's about women who didn't have choices but still chose kindness, chose sacrifice, chose to keep going. They didn't wear crowns, but they were queens of survival. You wake up to the sound of coughing, not polite, dry coughing, but the kind that shakes walls, the kind that rattles through ribs and splashes red on a piece of cloth tucked quietly beneath a pillow. That's not unusual. That's just the sound of mourning in a working-class district. In the 1800s, illness doesn't knock. It doesn't ask for permission. It's already inside, living with you, sleeping beside you, drinking the same water, breathing the same air. You just haven't noticed yet, but you will, soon. They call it consumption, because it consumes you. Tuberculosis, the slow and steady ghost. It hollows out your lungs like termites in old wood. First, you lose your appetite, then your weight, then your breath. You keep working, of course. No one pays you to be sick. You cough blood on your apron, wipe it off and keep serving tea. You climb factory stairs with aching bones. You breathe shallow to hide the pain. You pretend it's a cold. Everyone knows it's not, but no one says anything. You just fade and fade until one day you don't come in. And that's that. Other killers come faster. Cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, words whispered like curses. Diseases that travel in water and air. You might feel fine in the morning, dizzy by noon, and gone by nightfall. It happens so quickly you don't even have time to panic. Children vanish like they were never there. Entire streets fall silent in a week. And yet the world keeps spinning. Factories keep belching smoke. Horses keep clattering down cobblestone roads. Death here is just part of the background noise. And then there's the water. London's proud Thames River, a beautiful ribbon of sewage slicing through the heart of the city. It gleams in the sunlight. It smells like decay. It carries everything. Human waste, animal carcasses, chemical runoff, even the occasional body. The city drinks from it, or rather, companies promise they've filtered it. Through gravel. Maybe, maybe not. In the slums, hundreds of people share one public tap. Factories dump beside it. Rats bathe in it. You dip your cup in it, drink deeply, and hope for the best. Most days, hope is not enough. They call it the Great Stink. Some call it the Stew of Westminster. But whatever name you choose, it kills just the same. If disease doesn't get you, medicine might. Doctors aren't gods. They're gamblers with knives. Surgery is brutal. No anesthesia. No gloves. No sterilization. Just a strong man to hold you down, a stick to bite, and a bucket to catch the bleeding. Cutting off a limb is a race against time. Not to save your life, but to avoid hearing you scream too long. If you survive the cut, the real danger comes later. Infection. The invisible kind. Germ theory is still a joke in medical schools. Antiseptic? That's for dreamers. Hospitals should help. But they're more like waiting rooms for death. Overcrowded. Unwashed. No ventilation. Instruments are reused without cleaning. Surgeons wipe their hands on their aprons. Same one they've worn all day. The air smells like pus and sweat and despair. Beds are crammed side by side. You can hear the person dying next to you. You might share a pillow, a cough, a fate. Nobody explains anything. Nobody really knows anything. You have a fever? Here's a bottle of laudanum, alcohol and opium in a nice mix. You're anxious? More laudanum. You lost a child? Here, drink this. Sleep. Don't wake up if you don't want to. Laudanum is the cure-all for those with no cure. Which is to say, it's the cure for everyone. Those too poor or too scared for hospitals stay home. They mix vinegar with herbs. They boil garlic, smear onion paste, pray quietly. They light candles beside the bed. They hold hands. They whisper goodbyes. Not always because the end is near, but because they know the end is always near. Silence becomes medicine. Faith becomes anesthesia. And still, they hurt. Sometimes, it's the uncertainty that hurts most. Was it the water? Was it the coughing stranger? Was it the rat in the wall? Or was it just bad luck? You'll never know. There's no autopsy, no diagnosis, just grief and another body to bury. Death is common, but it's never casual. It leaves marks. On door frames, on blankets, on the faces of mothers too tired to cry again. Yet the city carries on. The factories roar. The chimneys cough. The river glistens. And the diseases, those quiet, perfect killers, keep walking unseen through alleys and homes and hospital halls. We remember the wars. We remember the monarchs. But we forget the dead who never got to make noise. The millions who didn't go out in battle, but in bed. In basements. In slums. In silence. Illness didn't wear a crown. It didn't raise a sword. But it won more ground than any army. That's what this chapter is about. Not just the statistics. Not just the symptoms. But the presence. The way disease became a character in every home. A breath at your neck. A shadow in the hall. Something you didn't see, but always felt. And through it all, people still tried to live. They worked. They raised children. They laughed. Even when their teeth hurt and their lungs burned. They believed. In remedies. In angels. In miracles. In the possibility, however faint, that tomorrow might not be worse. But deep down, they knew. The killer wasn't hiding. It was everywhere. In the glass of water. In the neighbor's cough. In the air, and no one was safe. When the sun sets, the city changes hands. The streets, once loud with the clatter of carts and market calls, fall eerily quiet. The light dims, but peace does not follow. Instead, the air grows thick, not just with fog, but with something heavier, something older. A kind of silence that listens back. The gas lamps flicker, barely slicing through the heavy smog that clings to everything like a funeral shroud. You can see shapes, but not details. You can hear footsteps, but never see who they belong to. Everything sinks into a quiet gray, dull, uncertain, and waiting. At night, criminals rule. They don't announce themselves. They don't wear masks or brandish weapons for show. They slip through alleys like smoke, like whispers. A pickpocket brushes your coat and keeps walking. You'll only notice your missing wallet 5 minutes later. Someone gets pulled into a doorway. A scream. Maybe, maybe not. Violence doesn't need volume here. It just needs shadows, and the city offers plenty. Mugging, slashing, kidnapping, assault. All of it happens beneath the gaslight's trembling glow, like a stage set for cruelty where the actors never miss their mark. The narrow alleys are their kingdom, unreachable, unknowable. Even the police hesitate before entering them, because even lawmen know some streets simply don't want witnesses. To step outside alone after nightfall is not boldness. It's gambling. Every footstep could be followed. Every corner turned might hide a hand. Or a knife. Or worse, your breath gets shorter. Not because you're tired, but because you're listening. Listening for trailing footsteps. For someone clearing their throat behind you. For a sudden silence that means someone stopped moving and is now watching you instead. Women fare the worst. A brush against the arm. A low whisper. The weight of being hunted. If you're lucky, you make it home untouched. If not, no one may notice you're missing until the morning. Or ever. And what of the police? They exist technically. You might see 2 officers strolling side by side, swinging batons more for their own comfort than for anyone else's safety. They know the layout of the streets, but also know which ones are best left undisturbed. Bribes help smooth things over. So does indifference. Maybe there's not enough manpower. Maybe there's not enough will. Or maybe the city itself is too large, too dark, too wild to tame. If someone gets attacked, well, maybe the police will show up. Maybe they're eating dinner. Maybe they've been paid to stay away. Maybe, deep down, no one really expects them to do anything at all. The truth is, the city doesn't sleep. It mutates, comes alive in the worst possible way. This isn't a world of jazz and dancing. It's a world of slammed doors, hurried footsteps, and quiet sobs muffled behind thin walls. Inside your own home, you are not safe. Mice scurry behind the boards. You hear them gnawing. Below you, a couple fights. Louder, then quieter, then silence. You hope it's over. You hope nothing broke. But maybe something did. A bone. Promise. A life. Sometimes people disappear. Not with drama. Not with search parties. Just gone. A neighbor doesn't come down for bread. A child's toy sits untouched on a step. No one asks questions. No one wants the answers, because everyone already knows. If something terrible happened, it happened quietly. And whoever did it, they'll never be caught, because no one saw anything. Or if they did, they learned long ago to keep their mouths shut. This chapter is not about a single crime. It's about the atmosphere. A world where crime breathes beside you, waits outside your window, walks the same path you do. It's about how fear becomes routine, how people stop asking for help because they know none will come. It's about a system that doesn't collapse all at once, but decays, slowly, invisibly, until there's nothing left but the illusion of safety. That's the horror. Not the violence itself, but how normal it becomes. How you adapt. How you learn to carry your keys between your knuckles. How you time your steps to avoid certain corners. How you teach your children to stay quiet, to not look too long at strangers, to come straight home. Every precaution feels reasonable until you realize they're all signs of surrender. We like to think of crime as an exception, a mistake, a crack in the system. But in this city, after dark, crime is the system. It dictates behavior. It shapes schedules, controls where you go and who you trust. And when the sun finally rises again, it doesn't bring relief. It brings a thin layer of denial, enough to get people moving again, working again, pretending again, until night comes back. And with it, the truth. Because deep down, they all know. The streets belong to someone else now. Not to the law, not to the people, but to something older, something colder. A force that doesn't wear a face, doesn't ask for mercy, and doesn't care about justice. It doesn't need to. It already owns the night. Crime, in Victorian times, wasn't always a choice, it was a lifeline, a last resort, a bitter medicine swallowed by the poor when every other option had already been stripped away. In a society built on towering hierarchies and locked doors, those at the bottom weren't criminals by nature. They were hungry, they were freezing, they were desperate, and sometimes committing a crime wasn't about greed. It was about surviving another day. When the world offers no escape route, breaking the law starts to feel like the most logical thing left to do. In the alleys and soot-covered corners of the Victorian city, crime wasn't random. It was structured, professional, organized not out of ambition, but necessity. What began as isolated acts of theft or deception slowly morphed into networks. Syndicates, mini-empires with codes, roles, and ranks. Territories were drawn, not with maps, but with whispered warnings and quiet threats. There were recruiters, trainers, watchers. Every member had a function, from the nimble-fingered pickpocket to the hawker selling counterfeit bread. Each played their part in an underground system far more efficient than the one above ground. Some jobs were more common than others. Pickpocketing, for instance, became an art form. Done right, it was nearly invisible. A quick brush of the coat, a bump in a crowd, a hand quicker than sight. 1 second, your coin purse is there. The next, it's feeding a stranger's children. Then there was petty theft, breaking into warehouses, shop fronts, sometimes even sacred spaces like churches. Desperation doesn't recognize sanctity. And then came the trickery. Fraud wasn't high-tech. It didn't need to be. It came in the form of bruised apples polished to shine, milk watered down until it tasted like chalk, biscuits just dry enough to hide the mold. But the game didn't stop at stealing things. Some took it further. They forged documents, recast coins, created false identities, not for glory but for food, shelter, a few hours of warmth. In a world where being invisible meant safety, altering who you were could buy time, or at least a second chance. Then there was the grimmest hustle of all, body snatching. Yes, actual bodies. Fresh ones. Those who practiced it were called resurrection men. By night, they dug up the newly buried and sold the corpses to medical schools that needed real cadavers for dissection. Morbid? Absolutely. But it paid more than sewing, scrubbing, or selling matches ever did. It was illegal. Horrifying. But again, it paid. And when you're choosing between morals and meat, hunger often wins. Ethics rarely survive in a house with no bread. The police? They knew. Of course, they did. But knowledge didn't always lead to action. Maybe they'd been bribed. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they were simply too few and too tired. Or maybe they understood that chasing one starving boy wouldn't change the system that made him steal in the first place. Some safe houses, homes with secret rooms filled with stolen goods, existed right under their noses, protected by silence and unofficial agreements. So crime became something strange. A steady job in an unsteady world. A role you could count on when everything else failed. A young thief didn't need a resume, just quick feet, sharp eyes, a gut full of courage, or maybe just hunger. In this world, honesty led to hunger. Deceit, meanwhile, meant dinner. The math wasn't hard. It was cruel, but it made sense. The system punished criminals, yes, but it created them first. People on the outside pointed fingers. They shook their heads. Thieves, they said. Liars. Cheats. But they never stopped to ask why. They never looked beyond the broken window or missing loaf. They never wondered what kind of world pushes a mother to steal bread for her child, or a boy to strip copper from a church bell just to buy a blanket. The truth is uncomfortable. Crime wasn't just about bad choices. It was about lack of choice. And while society condemned the thief, it rarely condemned the poverty that forged him. So the cycle continued. More children joined the ranks. More alleyways became recruitment centers. And behind every petty crime, there was a story, a mouth to feed, a rent to pay, a little dignity to reclaim. This chapter isn't an excuse. It's a revelation, a mirror held up to a system that failed its people so completely, breaking the law became the only way to survive it. We're not asked to forgive every crime. but we are asked to understand the roots of it. Because when society builds a wall too high to climb, don't be surprised if people start digging under it. So next time you read about a Victorian pickpocket or forger, don't just see the crime. See the cold room he returned to, the sister he bought bread for, the fire he couldn't afford. See the silence in the courtroom when he stood trial, with no family to speak on his behalf, no future to point to, just guilt and survival locked in a staring contest. Because sometimes, in the shadows of empire, crime wasn't rebellion. It was endurance. Even in the blackened lungs of the city, beneath layers of soot and sorrow, something warm persisted. Kindness. It didn't announce itself with grand gestures or golden halos. It didn't wear uniforms or sit in parliaments. But it was there, quiet, often invisible, and yet more vital than air in the choking fog. In a world cracked by poverty, disease, crime, and relentless death, the simple act of caring for another human being became a small rebellion. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that helped someone survive until morning. These acts weren't miracles. They were modest, often silent, and always precious. A worker giving half his last loaf of bread to a neighbor, knowing payday was still 2 nights away. A mother lending her only heated brick to an elderly man next door, because his bones screamed louder than her own. A girl handing over her worn-out shoes to someone who still had miles left to walk. No medals were given. No one clapped. Most of the time, the only reward was a nod. Maybe a weary smile. Rare, but real. You wouldn't find statues built for these people. Their stories weren't sung. And yet, their quiet mercy stitched the torn fabric of a city on the edge. Without them, everything might have collapsed. And then there were the pubs. Filthy, crowded, loud. The stench of sweat and cheap beer stuck to the walls. But they weren't just places to drink. They were sanctuaries, temporary heavens. In the flicker of lamplight, among the shouting and clinking glasses, people laughed. They sang. They shared stories. A butcher stood beside a beggar. A widow next to a chimney sweep. They had nothing to offer each other except time, a bad joke, or a shared song. But in that moment, it was enough. When your stomach is empty and your roof leaks, sometimes all you need is one person who still knows the words to your favorite tune. Then came the street performers and wandering vendors. The blind violinist near the bridge, the chestnut seller calling out in the fog, the storyteller spinning tales outside the bakery. They weren't entertainers. They were anchors, threading people together with songs and smells and simple human sound. In a city where survival often meant solitude, they reminded you, you're not alone. It's easy to mistake this kindness for innocence, to paint it as naive. But it wasn't. It was grit, born of shared suffering. This wasn't the kindness of fairy tales. It wasn't the well-fed handing out coins from carriages. This was the kindness that says, I know your pain, because I carry it too. When the system turned its back, when the law forgot your name, the only thing left was each other. And so people held on to each other, not out of weakness, but because they were strong enough to know they had to. They loved. They married. They had children. They hummed lullabies in the dark, wiped tears from muddy cheeks, scrubbed floors until their fingers cracked, tuned battered violins for Sunday dances. Because no one else was going to do it for them. They weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying to keep it from falling apart. And it worked. The city didn't implode. Soul damaged, yes, still pulsed. Because of them. Not the politicians. Not the businessmen. But the washerwomen who brought soup to a sick neighbor. The ragged boys who shared their stolen apple. The old man who stood watch when a young girl walked home alone. Their names faded. Their faces were forgotten. But their actions left fingerprints on the walls of time. This final chapter isn't about statistics. It's not about crime or hunger or injustice. It's about defiance. Not with fists, but with warmth. A soft kind of strength. The kind that bends but doesn't break. It's about the people who refused to let the darkness have the last word. Who found ways to give when they had nothing. Who held on to hope like it was bread, because sometimes it was. So when we look back at Victorian life, let's not only see the soot and the suffering. Let's remember the kindness carved into the cracks. The kindness that didn't make it into history books, but kept people breathing. That reminded the forgotten they were still human. That turned sharing a crust of bread into an act of glory. Because in the end, it wasn't the system that helped people survive. It was each other. Victorian London was never made for comfort. There was no such thing as a peaceful life, only survival, raw and relentless. Every passing day wasn't a blessing. It was a battle. The simple act of staying alive, getting through another frostbitten night, avoiding disease, hunger, violence, was itself a quiet triumph. This city, so often romanticized, was not built for the faint of heart. And yet, somehow, it was carried on the shoulders of people who were never meant to be remembered. They weren't kings or generals or the names etched into history books. They were the ones you'll never read about. The women who washed clothes until their knuckles split open. The children who sold matches for a coin to make it to tomorrow. The dock workers who dropped dead before reaching 40. They didn't build empires. They didn't write laws. But they built the world we live in now with their blood, their soot-covered hands, and their broken backs. That legacy, raw and unpolished, was carved into every alley and cobblestone. It wasn't done with glory. It was done with pain. And let's be honest, none of them chose that path. They weren't brave because they wanted to be. They simply didn't have a choice. There were no safety nets, no second chances. No one was coming to save them. They didn't endure because they were stronger than us. They endured because surrender meant starvation. Collapse meant death. And grief, it had to wait. Because the rent still had to be paid. Because mouths still had to be fed. Because the world doesn't pause for the poor to catch their breath. So ask yourself, would you have made it? Would you have lasted even a week on their streets, in their skin, under their burdens? Could you have faced the cold nights when your breath turned to frost and your child asked for food you didn't have? Could you have withstood the stink of the Thames, the crushing silence of empty pockets, the endless dread of another illness, another eviction, another grave? This isn't meant to shame you. It isn't meant to guilt you, but it is meant to make you stop, to consider, because the only reason you get to sit in warmth today watching this story unfold is because they didn't break. They kept going, day after day, with nothing more than grim determination and a desperate kind of love. And that should mean something. It should mean everything. We don't need a grand conclusion. There's no moral to wrap up neatly, no cinematic ending. There's only this: maybe you wouldn't have survived, but they did. And that matters. Deeply, quietly, permanently, not because they were saints, but because they were human, and they endured. Under the scorching skies of early 20th century Coyoacán, then just a small village on the outskirts of Mexico City, a girl was born on July 6, 1907. Her name was Frida Kahlo. The house she was born into, Casa Azul, the blue house, was no ordinary home. With cobalt blue walls, yellow trim, and a lush garden, it was a place bursting with color, contradiction, and a quiet strength. This house would hold her beginnings, her agony, her art, and eventually her death. And in between, it would witness the making of a legend. Frida was born into a world of dualities. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German Jewish photographer with a keen eye for structure, detail, and symmetry. Her mother, Matilda Calderon, was of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, devoutly Catholic, emotionally distant, and rooted in Mexican tradition. These two halves, European and indigenous, intellectual and spiritual, measured and mythic, collided within Frida. She didn't just inherit her father's talent and her mother's resilience. She inherited their contradictions and made them into her canvas. At the age of 6, Frida contracted polio, a disease that left her bedridden for months and permanently damaged her right leg. Her foot and leg became thinner, weaker, causing a limp that never left her. Children teased her, and the shame of physical difference settled in early. She often wore long skirts to hide her leg, but she never let it define her spirit. Instead, isolation pushed her inward. She read voraciously. She imagined fiercely. She learned to live in her mind and eventually in her art. Her father became her closest ally. While other girls were learning embroidery, Frida learned about photography, lighting, and perspective. Guillermo encouraged her to move, to paint, to stay mentally alert. From him, she absorbed not only technique, but the patience of an observer, the gift of seeing deeply and saying little. Art was not yet her path, but the seeds were quietly sown. Frida's earliest dream was not to become a painter, it was to become a doctor. She was determined to heal others, perhaps because she knew what it felt like to be broken. At 15, she was accepted into the National Preparatory School, one of Mexico's most prestigious institutions, and one rarely open to young women at the time. Among hundreds of male students, Frida stood out. She wasn't just brilliant. She was sharp-tongued, rebellious, and wildly curious. She joined a group of radical intellectuals called Los Cachuches, who debated philosophy, politics, and poetry. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that broke rules and reimagined power. Even then, before the accident that would shatter her spine and reshape her fate, Frida was already sketching herself into the world, with sharp lines, bold thought, and a selfhood too unruly for anyone else's expectations. Her childhood was not soft. It was colored by illness, sharpened by intellect, and defined by difference. But it was from this mixture, this wild blend of culture, pain, and defiance, that the voice of Frida Kahlo began to rise. A girl born in blue walls, with mismatched legs and unmatched will, was already preparing, not just to survive, but to transform everything she touched. On the afternoon of September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo boarded a wooden bus with her then-boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias. She was 18, bright, rebellious, brilliant, and had just left school. The two joked, flirted, perhaps argued, as young lovers do. The sun was low. The ride should have been routine. It wasn't. Moments later, an electric streetcar slammed into the side of the bus with such force that the vehicle was ripped apart like paper. Wood splintered, metal tore through bodies, and in the middle of that violence, time broke. Frida was thrown. A handrail pierced her lower abdomen and exited through her pelvis, cutting her in half without killing her. Her spine fractured in 3 places. Her pelvis was shattered. Her collarbone broke. Her right leg snapped like a twig in 11 places. Her foot was crushed. Her shoulder dislocated. Her ribs collapsed inward. She lost blood so quickly, people thought she was dead. Someone covered her body with a borrowed coat. Another person noticed something strange. Her skin sparkled, not with sweat or blood, but with gold dust, the pigment from the paint she had carried in her satchel. At the moment of impact, the tin had burst open, coating her broken body with something luminous, surreal, unforgettable. Frida Kahlo had just survived the accident that would divide her life into 2 halves, before and after. And in that sparkling moment of agony, a legend was born. She was rushed to the hospital, unconscious, barely breathing. The days that followed were a blur of morphine, surgeries, clamps, and silence. Her body was confined in a full-body cast, her mind trapped in immobility. She could no longer sit, could no longer walk, could no longer escape her own pain. And yet, from this prison of plaster and bone, something began to stir. Her mother, a stern woman not known for sentimentality, built her a custom-made easel, one that could rest on her bed. She hung a mirror above Frida's head, so she could look at herself without moving. And in that suspended state, Frida began to paint. At first, it was out of boredom, but quickly, the brush became something else. A scalpel, a tool of resistance, a whisper from her deepest places. She painted herself because she was the only subject available. But the images were not decorative. They were dissection tables. Her canvases showed a woman split open, pinned together, bleeding, staring back with steady eyes. What had begun as a career in medicine was now transformed. Her body, once meant to heal others, had become her greatest teacher. She would no longer study anatomy to cure illness. She would paint the wounds she carried, again and again, as both witness and survivor. Frida once said, "The accident and painting saved me." She meant it, Art didn't erase her pain, translated it. It gave her a way to stay alive without pretending to be whole. Her injuries forced her to leave the world of science, but in doing so, she entered a world even more intimate. The internal landscape of her own suffering turned sacred through brush and color. She did not choose painting as a calling, claimed her. In the quiet of convalescence, as bones mended crookedly and infections flared, a new kind of vision was born. One that saw beauty in pain. One that never looked away from the broken body. One that made vulnerability into language. Frida Kahlo did not become a painter because she wanted to. She became one because she had to, because death had knocked. And she answered not with surrender but with art. Frida Kahlo never set out to become an artist. She did not walk into an art academy, sign her name in ink, and declare her ambitions. Art for her was not a decision, it was a consequence. A consequence of pain, of stillness, of being shattered and left to rebuild, one stroke at a time. She never studied art formally. She was never a student of technique in the traditional sense. Her classroom was a hospital bed. Her professors were silence, mirrors, and agony. Her first subjects were not landscapes or still lives. They were her own eyes, her own broken spine, her own body locked in plaster. Painting began not as a pursuit, but as survival, as a whisper back to the universe that had tried to silence her. Those early paintings were intimate and raw, small in size but overwhelming in depth. They weren't decorative. They weren't meant to please. They were records, fragments of a body and spirit pieced back together through sheer will. As her recovery progressed, so did her language. Her canvases grew more ambitious, more symbolic, more confrontational. Frida developed a style that was never easy to categorize because it did not imitate, it originated. Though often called a surrealist, Frida rejected the label. "I never paint dreams," she said. "I paint my own reality." Her art was not about escaping the world. It was about diving deeper into it, into the gut of it. Her reality was filled with blood, thorns, skeletons, corsets, unborn children, and gazes that never flinched. Paintings like The Broken Column or Henry Ford Hospital were not metaphors. They were exacting visual autopsies of what it meant to live inside a body that refused to heal, in a mind that refused to be silent. Her subjects were relentless and recurring. Herself, her pain, her body, her love, her Mexico. Over a third of her works were self-portraits, not because of vanity, but because she knew herself best. And she needed to tell the truth about the 29 surgeries, about the miscarriages, about Diego's betrayals, about the isolation that comes not just from illness, but from being a woman in a world that demands your silence. In Henry Ford Hospital, she floats on a blood-soaked bed surrounded by symbols of grief, an anatomical model, a fetus, a snail, a fractured pelvis. She is naked. She is weeping, but she is also looking, always looking. She refuses to look away. That's what makes her work unbearable and unforgettable. Frida's paintings are not just about physical pain. They're about how that pain reshapes identity. Her art is a dialogue with the female body, not as something to be desired, but as something to be survived. She painted menstruation, abortion, infidelity, depression, and she did so without flinching, without apology, without asking permission. Her work is political, not in slogans, but in scars. She painted Mexico, too, but not the postcard version. Her canvases were rich with folk motifs, pre-Columbian gods, Aztec icons, and Catholic altars, all layered with blood and flowers. She wore Tehuana dresses and flower crowns, not as fashion, but as cultural armor. Her heritage wasn't background, it was foreground. Frida didn't just paint like a Mexican. She painted as Mexico itself. Defiant, colorful, scarred, beautiful. More than anything, Frida's work is a confrontation with herself, with the viewer, with history. Her painting was her protest against pain, against patriarchy, against disappearance. "I paint myself because I am so often alone," she once said, "and because I am the subject I know best." But she also painted herself because no one else could. Because her story, her rage, her tenderness, her complexity, none of it fit neatly into frames hung by others. Frida Kahlo didn't make art to be admired. She made it to survive. Each painting is a wound she chose to expose, not for pity, but for power. Her canvases are not windows. They are mirrors. And in them, we see what happens when a woman takes back her narrative. Not by erasing her scars, but by illuminating them. Her art was never just art. It was resistance in oil and color. It was breath. It was battle. And it was hers. All hers. When Frida Kahlo met Diego Rivera in 1928, it wasn't just the meeting of two artists. It was the collision of two storms. She was 21, bold and still recovering from the accident that had nearly killed her. He was 41, a national icon already regarded as one of Mexico's greatest painters, known for his grand murals, his radical politics, and his unapologetic appetite for life, food, fame, and women. Frida brought her paintings to him, not to flatter, but to ask one searing question. "Do you think I have talent?" Diego looked, paused, and replied, "Yes, and not just because I'm kind." That single moment sparked a connection that would define, consume, and reshape both their lives. They married the following year in 1929. For Frida's family, it was an odd pairing. A towering man with a reputation for womanizing, and a young woman already marked by pain. Her father famously called it the marriage of an elephant and a dove. But this was no fairy tale. Their union was rooted in mutual admiration, shared politics, and a profound devotion to Mexican identity. Yet from the start, it was also a powder keg. Frida and Diego were both larger than life, passionate, idealistic, and fiercely independent. But they were also deeply flawed. Diego couldn't remain faithful. He had countless affairs, including a devastating betrayal with Frida's own younger sister, Cristina. For Frida, this was a wound deeper than most of her physical scars. It shattered something inside her, leading to a spiral of rage, sorrow, and transformation. In response, Frida sought liberation on her own terms. She had affairs with both men and women, relationships that were not just reactions but declarations. With revolutionary Leon Trotsky, she explored political intimacy. With painter Georgia O'Keeffe, she explored something softer, more sensual. Her lovers were often artists, thinkers, exiles. She wasn't hiding. She was expanding. Through love and sex, she tested boundaries and reclaimed her body as her own, no longer defined solely by pain or by Diego. In 1939, they divorced. It was a rupture that felt final. Frida painted the two Fridas shortly after, an image of two selves holding hands, one bleeding, the other composed. It was a portrait of grief and duality. But just 1 year later, they remarried. This time, Frida laid out conditions. She would keep her name. She would keep her money. They would live in separate houses, connected only by a footbridge. She was married again, but never owned again. Their love was never peaceful, but it was powerful. Diego was a betrayal and a muse, a wound and a well. Frida once said, "I've suffered two great accidents in my life. One was the tram. The other was Diego. Diego was the worst. And yet, he was also her mirror, her enemy, her collaborator, her contradiction. Their connection was brutal, but it was also real. In the years they spent together, Frida's art deepened. Diego never tried to change her work. He encouraged it, championed it. And though he broke her heart repeatedly, he also took her seriously. As a painter, as a mind, as a woman who refused to be quiet. He hurt her, but he also saw her. And in return, she transformed that pain into canvas. Frida Kahlo did not just survive Diego Rivera. She transmuted him into color, shape, and story. He became both subject and catalyst, the chaos from which her most haunting, intimate works would emerge. Their love wasn't romantic. It was volcanic. And from its ash, Frida built her most unforgettable fire. When Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera to the United States in the early 1930s, she stepped into a new world, not just geographically but ideologically. While Diego was celebrated as a muralist, commissioned by wealthy patrons and American institutions, Frida entered as a quiet observer. From San Francisco to Detroit to New York, she stood behind him in photographs, but in private, she was taking notes. She saw opulence, machinery, steel, but she also saw something missing. "They have everything," she wrote to a friend, "except soul." While Diego was painting walls the size of cities, Frida was unraveling what it meant to exist within one. In Detroit, she suffered a miscarriage, a loss that became the centerpiece of her painting Henry Ford Hospital, a raw, unflinching portrait of blood, despair, and anatomy. It was unlike anything anyone in America was painting. While the outside world praised progress, Frida painted pain. Not abstract, not decorative, personal, physical, political. Her body was the canvas, her blood the pigment, her truth unavoidable, the wealth the superficiality, the glaring contrast between rich and poor. None of it impressed her. She mocked the American elite in letters home, finding them obsessed with comfort and appearances, blind to suffering. She craved the dirt, the contradictions, and the soulfulness of Mexico. America was clean, too clean, and Frida didn't trust clean things. In her bones, she missed the chaos, the color, the honest imperfection of her own country. When she finally returned to Mexico, it was not as the same woman who had left. She returned sharper, fiercer, more herself. The Frida who came back was unapologetically adorned in Tehuana dresses, rebozos, and woven flowers, symbols of indigenous strength, not mere fashion. Her art became a declaration of rootedness. In her work, myth met blood. Aztec gods whispered behind her self-portraits. Cornfields, monkeys, skeletons, and veins stretched across canvases like ancient scripts rewritten in a modern hand. Mexico wasn't just her home. It was her defiance. In 1939, her paintings reached Paris. André Breton, leader of the Surrealist movement, invited her to exhibit. Her piece, The Frame, became the first Mexican artwork acquired by the Louvre. She was praised by the likes of Picasso, Kandinsky, and Breton himself. They tried to claim her, label her, frame her within their theories of the dreamlike and subconscious. But Frida pushed back. "They think I'm a surrealist," she said. "But I'm not. I don't paint dreams. I paint my own reality." To Frida, art wasn't a mystical escape. It was a scalpel, cut deep. It revealed what doctors couldn't fix and what husbands couldn't soothe. It was her confrontation with pain, with politics, with the mirror. Her time in the US and France exposed her to global acclaim, but never swayed her convictions. While others saw Europe and America as artistic meccas, Frida saw places where truth was often disguised by fashion and theory. She didn't want to escape into style. She wanted to tell stories, raw, red, rooted. This chapter of her life marked a global turning point. The world started to see Frida, but more importantly, Frida saw the world and chose defiantly to remain herself. Her voice didn't shift. Her palette didn't fade. Her message didn't soften. She didn't leave Mexico behind. She carried it into every gallery, every canvas, every uncomfortable truth. And even when she stood beneath the lights of Paris, she painted with the dust of Coyoacán on her hands. By the 1940s, the body Frida Kahlo had fought for so long was beginning to give in. Slowly, painfully, and with every collapse of flesh and bone, her spirit rose stronger. The aftermath of her catastrophic bus accident, decades behind her, was still very much inside her. It had never left. Over the years, she had endured more than 30 surgeries. Metal rods, spinal fusions, failed grafts, bone infections, and endless nights of burning pain. Her spine had become a battlefield, and every inch of her frame was scarred from combat. Her health declined with a cruel rhythm. Days of bed rest turned into weeks, then months. Sleep became fractured. Infections became chronic. In 1953, her doctors gave her the news that felt like a final betrayal. Her right leg, already weak from polio and surgeries, had developed gangrene. It had to be amputated from the knee down. That loss sent her into a storm of despair. She wrote in her diary, not with self-pity, but with poetry. Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly? But even then, especially then, Frida didn't retreat from life. She retreated into art. From her bed, surrounded by mirrors, canvases, brushes taped to sticks, and trays of paint, she created. She painted not with distance, but with proximity to death. Her works in these years pulsed with darkness, but not defeat. They spoke of resistance, of survival not just as endurance, but as protest. Her images became rawer, more symbolic, soaked in blood, politics, and sacred pain. The body broken, bound, crucified, but always watching, always conscious, always fighting back. In 1953, something monumental happened. Frida, after years of being overshadowed by Diego, was finally given her first solo exhibition in Mexico. The show was hosted by Lola Alvarez Bravo, a fellow female artist and a pioneer in her own right. But by that point, Frida could barely sit up. Her doctors forbade her from attending. Her body said no, but Frida said yes. She called for an ambulance. She was carried into the gallery on a stretcher, laid in the center of the room like a painting herself, draped in embroidered Tewana dress, flowers in her hair, a smile defying the morphine coursing through her veins. Frida welcomed her guests from a hospital bed. She drank tequila. She sang. She laughed. She became the art, the altar, and the fire all at once. That moment wasn't a performance. It was a declaration. I am still here. And then the final painting. Shortly before her death in 1954, Frida completed a still life, not of suffering, not of fractured bones or bleeding hearts, but of watermelon, red, ripe, joyful slices of life. The painting was called Viva la Vida, long live life, she inscribed in careful letters across a bright slice. It was the last thing she painted, and perhaps the truest, because even at the edge of death, Frida did not whisper. She roared color. She did not retreat into bitterness. She carved gratitude into fruit. She chose to leave the world not with a whimper, but with paint under her nails and a phrase that still echoes. Viva la vida. She passed away on July 13, 1954, at the Blue House in Coyoacán, the same home where she was born. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those who knew her spoke of something deeper. She was tired of pain, tired of surgeries, tired of the war her body waged against her. A few days before her death, she had attended a protest against U.S. interference in Guatemala, her fist raised from a wheelchair. Revolution, even in her last breath. Her final diary entry was hauntingly simple. I hope the departure is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida Kahlo did not leave quietly. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Arts, Mexico's most revered cultural institution. Her coffin was draped in the red flag of the Communist Party. Friends, lovers, artists, and revolutionaries came to honor her, not just as a painter, but as a force. Diego Rivera stood over her casket, shattered. He called her the love of his life, a woman he had wounded, but who had loved him with more ferocity than he ever deserved. But Frida's greatest love was life itself. Not the soft, romantic kind, but the wild, bleeding, defiant kind. She painted through agony. She danced on one leg. She sang from a hospital bed. She left behind no apologies, only fire. In her final years, she became a myth, but not one made of fantasy. She was real, too real, and that's what made her eternal. Because Frida Kahlo didn't just survive pain. She made it sacred. Frida Kahlo died on July 13, 1954. She was 47 years old. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her believed it wasn't just her lungs that gave out. It was a soul, exhausted from decades of fighting pain, fighting betrayal, fighting the world's expectations and her own broken body. A few days earlier, she had marched in protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. In a wheelchair, her fist raised, her eyes sharp as ever, revolution still burning in her breath. Her final diary entry was only one line. It read, I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Words soft in phrasing, yet thunderous in finality. Some whispered of suicide. Others chose not to speak it aloud. What remained beyond dispute was that her departure, like her life, carried the weight of poetry, the beauty of defiance, and the silence of something sacred. She died in the Blue House, the same place where she was born, where she had painted, where she had loved, and where she had suffered over and over again. Her ashes rest there still, not hidden away, but held in a pre-Columbian urn, shaped like a toad, Diego's nickname for her. But Frida did not vanish. She left behind nearly 200 works of art. Portraits, still lives, dreamscapes soaked in blood, bone, and truth. Her paintings were never decorative. They were declarations. Every canvas held her body, every brushstroke, a pulse. She painted the unbearable. Miscarriage, disfigurement, loneliness, sexual longing, ideological passion. But she never asked for pity. She demanded presence. Frida Kahlo turned personal pain into something universal. She painted not to escape, but to witness, to mark the page with survival, with rebellion, with soul. Today, her face is everywhere, plastered on t-shirts, murals, phone cases, gallery walls. The monobrow, the crown of flowers, the unflinching stare. She has become a global icon, but not just for her art, for what she dared to be. She is a symbol of feminist power, a woman who didn't apologize for her strength or her vulnerability, a queer icon, fearless in her fluidity and desires, a champion of disability, someone who created through agony, who made the hospital bed into a studio, a voice of Mexican identity, one who draped herself in Tehuana dresses, who painted maize and blood and Aztec myth, not for fashion, but for truth. Frida didn't try to be perfect. She was never neat. She was honest, raw, complicated. Her life was not a clean arc. It was jagged, fractured, stitched together with color and pain. And in that, people saw themselves, especially those who had never seen themselves in art before. The Blue House, La Casa Azul, is now a museum in Coyoacan. It holds her original paintings, her corsets, her canes, her jewelry, her notebooks, her bed still there, the mirror on the canopy, unchanged. You walk through its cobalt blue halls and feel her everywhere, not just in the objects, but in the air. Frida Kahlo did not disappear in death. She expanded. She left not just paintings, but a challenge, a mirror, a manifesto. Dare to feel, dare to speak, dare to live out loud. In the end, she did not fade. She became eternal. Not because she was flawless, but because she was fire. Frida Kahlo was a painter, but that title no longer holds the weight of who she became. Over time, her work, her face, her defiance, crossed beyond the world of art. She stepped out of the canvas and into the world's imagination. She lived with pain, but she didn't let it define her. She loved with contradictions, but didn't hide them. She dressed in tradition not to conform, but to carry her roots. She became a figure people saw themselves in, not because she tried to represent anyone, but because she refused to represent anyone but herself. Frida lived in opposition, against the norms of gender, against ideals of beauty, against expectations of what a woman should do, say, or look like. She didn't soften her edges for acceptance. Her brows remained untouched, her mustache visible, her clothing deliberate, not costume, statement, not nostalgia, identity. She loved men. She loved women. She loved fiercely, openly, even when it was dangerous to do so. This wasn't rebellion for show. It was how she existed. She didn't ask for approval. She didn't apologize. She also didn't separate her art from her beliefs. Her Mexico was not abstract. It was layered blood, myth, revolution, earth. Her paintings weren't trying to escape into fantasy. They dug into memory, heritage, and the everyday lives of people forgotten by official history. She didn't stylize Mexico. She presented it, unvarnished, chaotic, beautiful, wounded, real. That honesty carried her image far. Today, her face is everywhere. Posters, murals, t-shirts, magazine covers. The flower crown, the heavy stare, the joined brows. She's been painted, sculpted, copied, parroted, sold. She became visible not because the art world wanted her. For decades after her death, she was largely ignored by institutions. But communities, women, queer people, Mexicans, artists outside the mainstream, held on to her. They recognized something familiar, someone who had lived through damage, someone who refused to vanish. And as her visibility grew, so did the tension. Frida rejected capitalism. Yet now her likeness sells lipstick and luxury handbags. There is a Frida Kahlo Barbie doll. Her face is printed on coffee mugs. Her legacy is now a product. It raises questions. What does it mean to honor someone who spent her life challenging systems of power by placing her image inside those same systems? Is it tribute or is it consumption? Some dismiss this as inevitable. Others see it as betrayal. But what's certain is this. Despite the commercialization, the core of what Frida stood for hasn't disappeared, because her story isn't built on perfection. It's built on fracture. She offered no solutions. She didn't claim healing was neat. She gave no promises. But she showed what it looks like to live honestly inside a damaged body. She painted what others were taught to hide: illness, rage, loss, longing, and gave it color, shape, and name. Her presence today can feel split. A global icon, but also a deeply personal one. A symbol on tote bags, yes, but also someone who still speaks in private to those who have felt broken, unseen, or out of place. Frida's work wasn't tidy. Neither is her legacy. But that's exactly why it continues to move. She left behind no grand theory. Just a record of being human in a body that hurt, in a world that judged, in a life that burned through every disguise. And if she remains, it's not because of what she wore or how she looked. It's because she never stopped showing up exactly as she was. In China, where the clouds are low and the wind whispers through the bamboo groves, something ancient lies curled in the mountains. A dragon, but not the fire-breathing beast of legend, not the winged serpent of old myths. This dragon is made of earth and stone, carved by calloused hands and generations of patience. It does not fly or roar. It lies still, silently stretching across the hillsides, rising and falling with the earth like a sleeping creature. The locals call it the dragon's spine. From a distance, its body seems to ripple across the mountains, each curve shimmering with water, rice, and a quiet pride. The terraced fields that make up its scales glisten in the light, reflecting the sky and tracing the muscles of the earth. But draw closer, and you will find something more alive than legend. This is the Longji Rice Terraces, a living sculpture shaped by human hands over centuries, where each layer is created, not given. This was not a place built overnight. It began more than 700 years ago, when the Zhuang and Yao people encountered steep, impassable slopes. Flat land was scarce. Machinery was non-existent, so they looked up, not down, and they asked a simple question: how can we feed ourselves here? The answer would take a lifetime. With mud baskets on their backs and stone tools in their hands, they chiseled away inch by inch, season by season. What they created was more than farmland. It was a living landscape, shaped by intuition and inherited wisdom. The dragon's body was not summoned. It was summoned into being through sweat and rhythm. With each new step, they taught the mountain to breathe with them. Rain became a resource. Gravity became an ally. Rice, the staple of life, took root where stone had once ruled. And as the steps climbed, they began to form a living thing, strong, sacred, eternal. This was more than agriculture. It was a covenant, a tacit agreement between man and mountain. No land was wasted. No edge was forced. Everything curved, flowed, listened. Today, the dragon still feeds the village. But more than that, it reminds us of what patience can build. In a world rushing forward, here is a dragon that has never been chased, only carved, layer by layer, dream by dream. Walking among the Longji terraces is to enter a story carved in the earth, not written in ink. The hills are not just hills. They breathe stories, whispered through bamboo and carried by the wind. And in that silence, among the mist and the rocks, the dragon still dreams. Over 700 years ago, long before the hum of machines and the spark of engines, in a time untouched by the conveniences of the modern world, a group of people stood before the mountains of Guangxi and made a choice. The land was steep, unforgiving. Flat soil for farming was rare, and the climate could be cruel. But instead of turning away, the Zhuang and the Yao, two ancient ethnic groups with deep roots in the mountains, chose to stay. They did not see the terrain as a wall to retreat from, but as a partner to understand, to shape, and to eventually live with. In that choice began the quiet birth of one of humanity's most enduring masterpieces. These weren't warriors or kings. They were farmers, families, people whose lives were wrapped in the rhythms of the earth. They had no machines, no metal tools, no blueprints or engineers. What they did have was time, and patience, and a different kind of genius. The ability to observe the land, listen to water, and shape the mountain not with force, but with rhythm. They asked themselves a question. How do we sow? The answer would come. With nothing more than woven baskets, wooden shovels, stone picks, and their own hands, they began to etch the slopes. Inch by inch, layer by layer. Every season, another row. Every year, another step. There was no rush, no shortcuts, just determination passed from hand to hand, season to season. What began as survival soon became a kind of devotion. These terraces weren't just fields. They were a living dialogue between people and land, carried on in silence, in sweat, in instinct. There were no maps, no measurements, no right angles or rulers. The mountain dictated the rules, and the people responded not with calculations but with intuition. Children learned by standing in the water, feeling the pull of the mud. Elders read the mountain like a memory, noting the slope of a hill, the sound of water pooling, the strength of the rain. A wrong incline would cause flooding. Too flat and water would stagnate. So they adjusted with care, measuring not in centimeters, but in seasons and senses. Each terrace was both engineering and inheritance, a gift left by those who came before and a foundation for those who would follow. These were not fields made in years or even decades, they were made in centuries. A father would build what his son would finish. A grandmother would plant what her granddaughter would someday harvest. In this way, the terraces became not just a source of food, but a legacy sculpted in earth, an act of defiance against the impossible, carved slowly, lovingly, into the bones of the mountain. So no, the Longji terraces were not made by machines. They were made by hands, by backs bent under sun and rain, by people who believed that even the harshest ground could be taught to feed life, if one was patient enough to listen. And so, with each generation, the dragon's body began to take shape, not with fire, but with faith, not with speed, but with time. At the heart of the Longji terraces, beneath every curve and ripple of the land, flows something more than water. It is the quiet pulse that gives life to the dragon. Not a mechanical system, not pipes or pumps, but a sacred choreography of earth and gravity, of patience and instinct. The water is its blood, and like any living being, its circulation must be tended, honored, and understood. The source is simple: rainfall, spring water, the generosity of the mountaintops. There are no engines humming in the background, no man-made reservoirs, just the sky and the stones. Water gathers from natural springs near the peaks, collects in narrow channels and earthen canals, and begins its journey downward, an ancient rhythm, orchestrated not by machines, but by slope and time. Gravity is the silent partner in this system. It is not fought but welcomed. The terraces are designed to work with the mountain, not against it. Each level is slightly lower than the last, allowing water to trickle naturally from one field to the next. This cascade is neither hurried nor chaotic. It is measured, balanced, almost musical. Water arrives where it is needed, no more, no less, then continues its descent. It is a dance not of chaos, but of control. This hydraulic ballet is not accidental. It's the result of generations tuning every bend, every gate, every channel with precision. Each terrace is both a recipient and a donor, accepting water, using what it needs, then passing the rest. No level floods, no level dries out. The entire system breathes together, a long exhale down the mountain's spine. And yet, there are no metal valves, no gauges, no monitors. Control lies in the hands of the farmers, literally. Water is guided by simple gates made of stone or wood, hand-carved and maintained by villagers themselves. These gates are opened or closed manually, based not on timers or instructions, but on familiarity. Knowledge passed down through observation, habit, and intuition. It's a form of communication not just with each other, but with the land. Every day, farmers walk the ridges. They don't just look, they listen, they feel. A strange gurgle might mean a leak. A silence where there should be flow could signal a blockage. To them, water speaks and they know its language. Tending the system is not unlike tuning an instrument. Each sound has a pitch, a tone, a warning. To mishear is to misstep. But to listen closely is to keep the dragon alive. Water here is more than resource. It is spirit. It is trust. To care for it is both technical and sacred. The farmers are not just cultivators. They are guardians of the dragon's lifeblood. With each drop that moves, they maintain a covenant. A promise that as long as the water flows, the land will live. Not through dominance, but through respect. Not by force, but through harmony. Because here, among the stones and silence, water doesn't just nourish rice. It nourishes memory, rhythm, and the quiet beating heart of something greater than themselves. ChatGPT to NOI. Spring begins not with blossoms, but with reflection. As the snow melts from the mountain peaks and the first waters are guided into the fields, the terraces of Longji shimmer like mirrors newly polished. The still surface of each rice paddy captures the sky above. Clouds drifting, pale sunlight softening the blue, the outlines of bamboo swaying gently in the breeze. It's as if heaven and earth have folded into each other. Walking among these flooded fields feels like stepping into the sky, as if each step is taken not on ground, but on light. This is the first breath of the dragon, awakening after a long winter slumber, quiet, clear, and full of promise. Then comes summer. The terraces, once silver, now surge with green. Rice stalks rise boldly from the water, covering every step of the mountainside with a blanket of emerald life. From a distance, the hills look like flowing waterfalls made of jade. In the fields, farmers wade knee-deep through water, their wide straw hats bobbing like sails on a green sea. Frogs croak, dragonflies dart, wind moves through leaves, and water trickles in steady rhythm. The whole landscape pulses. It's not just growing, it's alive. The dragon is not only awake now, it is moving. This is its heartbeat, strong and steady, thumping through every blade of rice. In autumn, the dragon shines. The rice ripens and turns gold, and the terraces catch the sun like sequins draped over the mountain. The fields resemble bands of liquid gold, tier upon tier, glowing under clear skies. It is the season of gathering, of celebration. Villagers sing, drums echo, families return to feast, to harvest, to honor the land that fed them. Glutinous rice is steamed, stories are shared, and traditional dances are performed in courtyards strung with lanterns. This is the dragon's most generous breath, the exhale of reward, offering its treasure back to those who have waited. Then comes winter. The fields go quiet. Water drains or freezes. Sometimes, snow falls, covering the terraces in a soft white quilt. Other times, frost clings to the stones like delicate lace. No farmers walk the ridges. No tools scrape the earth. Only the whisper of wind passes through the bamboo. The dragon rests again, its back still visible, its breath now shallow, waiting. This is not an ending. It is a sacred pause, a needed silence before the next awakening. The terraces do not simply reflect weather, they reflect rhythm. A rhythm older than memory. Every season is a verse in an unending poem, written not with ink, but with light, color, and time. The dragon does not roar. It breathes. Through rice and rain, snow and silence. And as long as the seasons turn, it will never stop. Along the dragon's spine lie ancient villages, Pingon, Dai, Jinzhen. Where time does not pass, it stands still. These are more than settlements. They are living museums. Every house, balcony, and passageway hold stories passed from hand to hand, from foot to foot. The villages do not stand on steps. They flow with them. The houses are nestled in the mountains, their wooden skeletons hugging the curves of the land like memories that never fade. Seen from above, they appear as wooden lanterns floating gently on waves of green rice. The architecture is not random. It is the result of understanding the mountain. The houses are built on stilts, raised above the wet ground, not just to protect against flooding, but to breathe with the slope. Rain slides down from the dark, slanted roofs, reflecting the very terraces they overlook. The union of house and earth is not decoration. It is survival made beautiful. Here, function and form intertwine, rooted in generations of adaptation. Inside these wooden houses, life is communal. Families span generations under one roof. Grandparents care for children. Parents work in the fields. Children learn by watching hands, not reading books. A meal is more than just food. It is a moment when the past merges with the present and makes room for the future. Individualism is rare. Instead, there is a bond, a quiet dependence, as if the entire village breathes with one set of lungs. Cultural traditions are woven into everything. Red Dao women, with their hair never cut, curl their long black locks into elegant crowns. Occasionally, they let their hair fall like soft waterfalls as they bathe in the river. A sight so graceful it belongs to legend. Their hands work the looms, threading indigo-dyed cloth with symbols of water, rice, and dragon tails. Each pattern is not decorative. It tells a story. Music echoes through the hills, carried by bamboo flutes and bronze drums. During festivals, villagers dance, chant, and offer food to the mountain and water gods. Rituals are not just for ritual, they flow into everyday life. There is no separation between spirit and reality. Firewood crackles in a traditional fireplace. Tea is brewed with leaves collected from the surrounding hills. Before vegetables are picked, a silent prayer is whispered. Before water is poured into the fields, a hand is raised to the sky. These actions are not performances. They are instincts. Traditions are not remembered here. They are lived. Longji culture is not trapped behind museum glass. It moves with the wind, sings to the drums, is in the folds of her hair. It's a way of being, not a history. Here, people don't walk on the land, they walk with the land. And in that walking, they become part of the dragon's breath. In Longji, the terraces are sacred scriptures written on earth and water. To the villagers, they are more than mere agricultural feats. They are alive. They breathe. They dream. And in that dream lies an ancient truth passed down from whisper to whisper, never written down, but never forgotten. These terraces. The legend is not told as myth, but accepted as memory. The people say that the dragon came to rest on the mountains, arching its massive body over the ridges. Its back arched, its scales glistened, and the earth responded. The terraces formed where its body lay, each curve a ripple of its breath, each line a glistening scale. And as the mist fell from the valleys, moving slowly over the hills like a silken blanket, the villagers smiled softly and said, "The earth shook, the air thickened," but the terraced fields were not just formed by legend. During times of famine, the elders recounted, ancestors climbed the mountains to cry for help. Their hands were empty, their hearts were full. They raised their voices to the sky, and the gods, moved by their devotion, sent rain, and with it a vision, a revelation of how to carve out the mountains layer by layer so that the rice could take root. It was not a command, it was a gift. From then on, farming was no longer seen as survival but obedience. These beliefs are not written in any book, but they live in every action. They are hidden in the songs sung while planting. They linger in the silence that covers the misty morning's blind. No tree is cut without a prayer. No water is poured into the field without a silent offering. Maybe a little rice wine, maybe a whisper. Silence is respected. Stillness is respected. Because when the dragon sleeps, you sleep too. The sacred is not separate from the earth. Children do not learn it in temples, they learn by example. They watch their grandmother burn incense before planting the first tree. They see their father bow to the stream before redirecting its flow. They understand, without explanation, that faith is not ritual. It is continuity. It is reverence wrapped in repetition. It is the invisible woven into the visible. For the people of Longji, a stalk of rice is not just food but a prayer planted high. A terraced field is not just a field but a hymn carved into the ground. What they do here is not agriculture in the conventional sense. It is a covenant, a living agreement between man, land, spirit, and sky. A covenant that requires no contracts, only care. No doctrine, only devotion. In Longji, farming is trust. Trust is remembering. And remembering is walking with the dragon, season after season, breath after breath. Modernization found its way up the mountain. Not suddenly, but gradually, like mist creeping through bamboo. It came with footsteps not of farmers, but of tourists. With hands not caked in mud, but holding cameras, smartphones, and selfie sticks. What was once a hidden rhythm known only to those who called Longji home is now a destination, typed into search bars, pinned on digital maps. The narrow trails once marked by woven sandals now echo with the sound of hiking boots and spoken languages from half a world away. Technology followed. Signal towers rose. Signs in Mandarin and English appeared beside sacred springs. Drones buzzed in skies once ruled only by birds. And along with this flow of visitors came questions the mountain had never had to answer before. Would this place, this living dragon carved in stone, be preserved or performed? Would its story be told in truth or flattened into postcards? Would the old wooden houses give way to concrete convenience? Would tradition be painted on like decoration? First there was worry. A quiet fear whispered among the villagers that what made Longji real would be turned into a spectacle, that what took centuries to shape could be diluted in a few years of tourism. But the people did not respond with anger or retreat. Instead, they chose something rare. They adapted gently, wisely, without losing themselves. Homestays began to open, not resorts, not hotels, but homes. Real homes, where guests sleep under timber beams, wake to the sound of chickens, and eat sticky rice steamed in bamboo cut that morning. The rooms aren't polished by uniform service. They're worn with real life. And that's the point. Visitors are not here to observe from a distance. They are here to step inside a slower rhythm. And even as the village welcomes guests, the fields remain untouched by machines. Rice is still planted by hand. Water is still released with care. Prayers are still whispered before the first gate opens. The songs of the harvest are still sung by those whose hands know the soil, not the script. Tourism has not replaced agriculture, it walks beside it. The money helps repair old homes. It helps bring sons and daughters back from cities. Some come home to work the fields again. Others return to teach visitors, to pass on the story with pride instead of nostalgia. The dragon, they know, must move, but it does not have to forget how to breathe. Longji did not freeze in time. It did not shut its gates or sell its soul. It chose something harder, to absorb the change without losing its shape, to welcome the world without abandoning its heartbeat. And so the terraces remain, not as relics, but as proof that when people live in tune with their land, progress doesn't erase the past. It deepens its roots. The terraces of Longji are not just a feat of agriculture. They are a living covenant, a silent pact between human hands and the bones of the earth. Not written in ink, not signed in haste, but etched layer by layer with sweat, with mud, with time. They are a contract forged through generations, not with legal clauses, but with sunrises, with monsoon rains, and with the patience to return season after season, never asking for reward, only the chance to begin again. It is not just land that is cultivated here. It is trust. These fields are not born from conquest. The people of Longji did not tame the mountain by force. They did not blast it or bend it. They listened. They followed its curves, its silences, its shifting moods. They adjusted gently. They shaped without cutting. They carved without scarring. It is a philosophy that runs deeper than farming, a way of life that says, do not overpower nature. Align with it. Let it guide you. Bend like the bamboo. Flow like the stream. Breathe like the mountain. And that's where the beauty lies, not in drama or spectacle, but in the persistence of quiet things. In the way water glides across a terrace with no fanfare. In the way hands move rhythmically through rice fields, planting, pressing, rising, repeating. In the stillness of dawn before the tools begin their work. The terraces don't demand attention. They earn reverence slowly. They do not shout, they endure. That endurance becomes their radiance. To plant a seed here is not just to grow food. It is to make a promise. Promise to your family. A promise to those who came before. A promise to the land itself that you will continue the rhythm. That you will not rush it, not replace it, not forget it. A bowl of rice on a family table is more than sustenance. It is memory made edible. To guide the water down a channel is to remember how your grandfather's hands did the same. To walk the ridges in silence is to hear the footsteps of your grandmother, steady and barefoot. Every action, no matter how small, carries a weight far beyond the moment. Every hat lua, every scoop of earth, every tightened rope on a terrace wall is part of something vast, something slow, something sacred. It is the breath of the dragon, not loud, not fiery, but deep and steady, pulsing quietly through time. And in that breath is a lesson, that in a world obsessed with speed and disruption, with loud innovation and instant change, there are still places that choose the long way, that choose depth over noise, that believe in building things not to be seen quickly, but to be felt forever. Longji is not frozen in the past. It is not a museum. It is a rhythm still beating, a harmony still unfolding. It tells us that not all progress looks like movement. Sometimes progress looks like staying, like repeating, like remembering. The terraces do not resist time, they flow with it. They are not monuments. They are reminders that true greatness does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as a single drop of water, falling exactly where it needs to, again, and again, and again. Ancient engineers weren't just skilled. They knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't simply build machines. They crafted strategy, emotion, and the art of psychological warfare. Each siege engine was more than a weapon. It was a calculated expression of force, precision, and fear. In the beginning, it looked simple. A log, a few soldiers, and the reckless courage to slam it against the enemy gates like crazed lumberjacks. But that wasn't recklessness, it was the first step in a military evolution. From handheld rams came wheeled battering beasts with roofs. From swinging logs came torsion catapults, counterweight trebuchets, and siege towers tall as buildings. And with each upgrade came layered meaning. Because siege warfare was never just about breaking walls, it was about performance. It was theater with iron and fire, fear and thunder. A catapult didn't just hurl rocks, it hurled dread. A siege tower didn't just carry soldiers, it carried a message. We're coming in, no matter what. From flaming corpses to collapsing towers, from brute force to psychological collapse, siege warfare was always a battle between physics and spirit. And to understand the terror it unleashed, we begin with the first weapon, the battering ram. The earliest battering rams were brutally simple. A tree trunk, a handful of soldiers, raw force. The men lifted the log like frenzied lumberjacks and hurled it into enemy gates with nothing but sweat and determination. There were no wheels, no protection, no mechanics, just wood, muscle, and the sound of splintering resistance. But make no mistake, this wasn't chaos. It was calculated aggression. Crude, yes, but effective enough to lay the foundation for everything that came after. Because once the basic principle proved its worth, wood against stone, motion against stillness, the race began. How to strike harder, longer, and without dying in the process. That's when the engineers stepped in. They realized something essential. To keep attacking, the attackers had to stay alive. The solution encased the ram in a wooden frame mounted on wheels. Now it could be rolled forward, protected by a roof often covered in soaked hides to absorb fire. No longer exposed to arrows, boiling oil, or falling rocks, the crew could focus on one task, bringing the wall down. Suddenly, the ram wasn't just a blunt object. It became a weapon of war. The Assyrians took it even further. They made the ram a spectacle. Their siege art from Nineveh shows monstrous devices with iron-tipped heads rolling forward like slow-moving gods of destruction. The message was clear: surrender or watch your walls crumble. The ram didn't need to fire a single projectile. Its sheer presence, its mass, its movement, its thunderous pounding, was enough to break morale before it broke stone. And it didn't stop at the gate. These rams could be redirected to attack weaker sections of the wall, the base of watchtowers, or structural gaps in the architecture. Entire squads operated in unison, attacking from multiple angles. It was strategy wrapped in wood and steel. The Greeks improved the form, sleeker designs, more balanced weight, easier mobility. But it was the Romans who perfected the function. Under their hands, the battering ram evolved into a standardized tool of military dominance. They optimized the frame, engineered suspension systems to absorb impact, and increased the swing force with better leverage and control. They even gave it a name, Ares, Latin for ram. Suspended by chains or ropes inside massive frames, these wooden beams became deadly pendulums. As they swung, they created a rhythmic beat, like thunder echoing through stone corridors. The sound alone was enough to unnerve defenders. But these machines were far from foolproof. Operating one took dozens of men, pushing, steering, keeping the momentum alive. They had to fend off flaming arrows, dodge rocks, and fix jams on the fly. One broken axle, one spark catching dry wood, and the beast was dead in the water. A dead ram was a dead threat. But when it worked, when the rhythm was right and the blows landed in sequence, it was unstoppable. Wood muscle against masonry nerve. A heartbeat of destruction pounding into stone. The only way to stop it was to break it, before it broke you. And if the battering ram was the beast at the gate, then what came next was the archer in the sky, the catapult. If the battering ram was brute force at your doorstep, then the catapult was a whisper of death from the sky. Unlike the ram, which needed to roll up close and slam into stone, the catapult operated from a distance. It didn't knock, it hurled. And what it hurled wasn't just stone, it was fear. You didn't see the soldier. You didn't hear the battle cry. You just heard the wind tear open as a massive object screamed through the air and crashed down somewhere nearby, or right on top of you. Siege warfare had entered a new era, where terror came not from clashing steel, but from silence followed by sudden impact. These machines weren't just meant to destroy walls, they were designed to unravel the mind. When rocks fall from nowhere, when death descends like divine punishment, your thoughts don't run to strategy, they run to survival. That psychological edge was everything. And it began in the 4th century BCE, in the minds of Greek engineers looking for a way to fight smarter, not harder. They wanted reach, power, safety, and so the first catapults were born. Dionysius of Syracuse, the war-hungry tyrant with a taste for innovation, commissioned the first torsion-powered machines. They didn't use fire or steam, but raw tension, created by tightly twisted cords made from sinew, hair, or animal tendon. These cords stored massive amounts of potential energy. Release that energy and you didn't just shoot, you launched devastation. The genius was in the physics. Tighten the cord, wind it tighter still, and you compress power into a single breath. Then release. The result? Stones, javelins, or even flaming payloads hurled hundreds of meters into enemy lines. The Greeks had discovered how to weaponize stored tension, and it changed the face of siege warfare forever. One variant, the ballista, looked like a crossbow scaled for giants. Twin arms pulled back in harmony, firing giant bolts with frightening accuracy. They weren't just for breaking walls. They were sniper rifles of the ancient world. They pierced shields, armor, horses, and confidence. The sharp whistle of a ballista bolt could send men scrambling before the first casualty even hit the ground. Then came the onager, the kicking mule of Roman siegecraft. It didn't aim as precisely as the ballista, but it hit harder and wider. With a single vertical arm, it flung stones in a graceful arc that ended in explosive chaos. The name came from the way it kicked back when fired, like a wild animal lashing out. The Romans didn't just adopt these machines. They perfected them. They made them modular breakdown kits that could be wheeled in, assembled in hours, and turned loose by trained legionnaires. Their versions could fire 60-pound stones with ease, smashing through gates, towers, or unlucky flesh and bone. But catapults weren't just tools of destruction. They were message delivery systems. A flaming projectile was one thing. A disease-ridden corpse was another. Heads of enemy generals, bound and bloodied, were lobbed into cities as a promise of what was coming. Some payloads carried death. Others carried despair. Either way, the catapult didn't just break down stone. It cracked the human psyche. And if the catapult was the first true artillery of war, the trebuchet was its angry, towering god. The trebuchet was not just a machine, it was gravity turned into a weapon. Unlike the catapult, which relied on twisted ropes and sinew to generate force, the trebuchet harnessed something far simpler and far deadlier: falling weight. At its core was a single truth of physics: what goes up must come down. And when a massive counterweight dropped, it whipped a long arm upward, launching a sling and its deadly payload high into the sky. The result? Controlled devastation, quiet precision, a wooden fist from the heavens, hammering down with methodical fury. No need to roll to the gate. No need to get close. The trebuchet could flatten walls from a safe distance, and it did so with terrifying accuracy. Its roots stretched back to ancient China, where, by the 4th century BCE, engineers had created early traction trebuchets. Machines operated not by weights, but by teams of men pulling ropes. Cruder, smaller, and less powerful than later models, these traction engines laid the foundation for a revolution in siege warfare. But the true breakthrough came centuries later, in the 12th century, when the counterweight trebuchet appeared, likely spreading through Byzantine and Islamic territories before sweeping across medieval Europe. Now, instead of relying on manpower, the machine carried its own force. A block of stone, iron, or lead suspended on one side of the arm. Release the weight and the other side, cradling a sling, snapped forward. A well-built trebuchet could hurl a 300-pound stone more than 300 meters with devastating effect. Not just a gate-buster, the trebuchet could aim over walls, smashing into towers, supply depots, and courtyards. It didn't just weaken defenses. It tore into the heart of a city, physically and psychologically. But what made the trebuchet truly terrifying wasn't just what it did to buildings. It was what it could carry. This was no simple stone thrower. It hurled disease-ridden carcasses into enemy territory, turning illness into a weapon. It sent burning pitch and slaked lime crashing into soldiers, leaving them blind and blistered. It carried letters, curses, even severed heads, symbols of doom and surrender. In every sense, the trebuchet was not just a siege engine. It was a messenger. And the message was clear: there is nowhere you are safe. No story captures its impact more than the tale of Warwolf, the colossal trebuchet of King Edward I of England. Built during the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, it was so massive, so intimidating, that the defenders surrendered before it even fired. But Edward refused their surrender. He wanted to use the machine, and he did, because in that age, just building a trebuchet was a show of force. Firing it was a declaration of absolute dominance. Still, the trebuchet had its flaws. It wasn't nimble. It wasn't fast. It took hours to construct, required flat ground, and needed engineers who could calculate angles, distances, and counterweight mass with meticulous precision. But when built and placed correctly, nothing else compared. No wall could breathe easy under its shadow. And if the trebuchet was a storm rolling in from the distance, then the next weapon, the siege tower, was the declaration delivered face to face. We are not just coming over your walls. We are walking through them. The siege tower wasn't subtle. It didn't creep. It didn't whisper. It roared, rolling forward like a wooden fortress on wheels, straight toward the enemy wall. Towering high with multiple floors, these colossal structures were built entirely from wood, covered in wet animal hides to resist flaming arrows and boiling oil. They carried within them entire squads of soldiers, infantry, archers, and engineers, ready to breach the defenses from above. Some even housed small catapults, making them both mobile barracks and battle platforms. A siege tower was a war machine, troop carrier, and siege engine all in one. The Assyrians were among the first to deploy them in the 9th century BCE. Their early towers were simpler but effective, wooden structures with internal stairs pushed up to walls by manpower. These early designs would later be refined and elevated literally by the Greeks and Hellenistic states, and none more ambitious than the infamous Helepolis. Commissioned by Demetrius Poliorcetes in 305 BCE, the Helepolis was the siege tower reimagined as Apocalypse. Standing over 30 meters tall, clad in iron plates, equipped with catapults, and manned by thousands, it was the largest war machine of its time. It moved barely, on massive wheels, and took hundreds of men to maneuver. Eventually, it collapsed under its own weight, but it remained a symbol of how far military ambition would reach when the goal was to crush cities from above. Strategically, the tower's purpose was simple: bypass the gate, go over the wall. Once positioned against the ramparts, a drawbridge would be lowered from the top floor, creating a direct pathway for soldiers to storm the battlements. No more bottlenecks at the gate. No more being funneled through choke points. This was the straightest, boldest way in over the top, and from those top decks, archers reigned supreme. Elevated high above the wall, they rained arrows down on defenders with better range and better angles. Their presence disrupted enemy formations, broke morale, and shielded the advancing troops below. High ground wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was psychological dominance. But siege towers had their flaws. They required flat, stable ground, no swamps, no slopes. Mud, narrow passes, or steep terrain could render them useless. Defenders adapted to digging trenches, building secondary walls, or targeting wheels and support beams with fire, stones, and pitch. One flaming hit, one broken axle, and the towering beast became a burning coffin. Yet for all their weaknesses, siege towers transformed warfare. They turned sieges into vertical battles, where elevation meant everything. When the ramp dropped, there was no retreat. You climbed the tower to fight or to die. It was a race for height, for dominance, for the very top of the wall. But not all attacks came from above. Some of the deadliest assaults in siege warfare came silently, from beneath your feet. Not every siege weapon crashed through gates or loomed above ramparts. Some crept beneath your feet. Undermining, also known as sapping, was one of the most silent, suffocating, and devastating tactics in all of siege warfare. There were no roars, no thunder, no flying rocks, just the rhythmic, muffled sound of picks striking earth. No shouting, no spectacle, just the slow, deliberate scraping of death rising from underground. The goal was as simple as it was cruel: bring down a section of the wall by destroying its foundation. No need to scale, batter, or burn, just collapse. The method was chilling in its precision. First, dig a tunnel directly under the targeted section of wall. Then, reinforce the roof of the tunnel with timber supports, temporary bones for a soon-to-be corpse. Finally, pack the space with fuel, usually dry wood, pitch, or animal fat, and set it ablaze. The supports would burn, the tunnel would collapse, and the wall above, robbed of its footing, would come crashing down like rotten bread. No warning, no mercy, just sudden destruction. History offers chilling examples. In 429 BCE, during the siege of Plataea, Spartan forces began tunneling beneath the enemy walls. But the defenders weren't idle. Realizing what was happening, they dug countermines, tunnels of their own designed to intersect the Spartan effort. Beneath the city, in total darkness, men clashed with shovels, knives, and desperation. It wasn't a battle, it was a burial in progress. These underground encounters, known as countermining, were among the most brutal and claustrophobic in all of military history. Then there's Rochester, 1212. King John of England laid siege to the formidable castle. His engineers dug a mine beneath the South Tower and, in an act of cold ingenuity, filled the space with pig fat, the most flammable material available. The result? Firestorm beneath stone. The supports collapsed, and the tower followed, toppling in a cascade of smoke, fire, and shattered defense. The defenders surrendered soon after, stunned not by fire from above, but by the betrayal of the ground itself. By the 13th century, siege engineers were no longer just builders, they were geologists. They studied soil composition, calculated load-bearing thresholds, and planned collapses with surgical accuracy. They didn't just attack, they listened. They felt the ground. They knew how walls breathed, shifted, and died. These men could look at a fortress and know exactly where it would fall. But even as they worked in shadows, the defenders above had weapons of their own, and sometimes what rained from the sky was even worse than what rose from below. Siege warfare was never one-sided. For every ram that smashed forward, for every trebuchet that hurled destruction from the sky, there were defenders waiting with tricks, traps, and terror of their own. Holding the wall wasn't just about strength. It was about surviving the storm with cunning and endurance. The art of defense was brutal, brilliant, and often just as devastating as the attack. One of the most terrifying tools in the defender's arsenal was Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century, it was the ancient world's napalm. This mysterious substance could cling to ships, skin, and stone, burning even on water, and it couldn't be extinguished by water. Whether launched in ceramic jars or sprayed through siphon-like nozzles, Greek fire turned whole fleets into infernos and sieges into nightmares. Its formula is still unknown, one of history's most closely guarded military secrets. Then came the vertical weapons. Boiling water, searing oil, and scalding sand poured from murder holes above gates and towers. Water was quick and cruel, oil was sticky and lethal, especially if lit after impact. But it was the sand that showed true malice. Heated until blistering, it slipped between gaps in armor, around the neck, wrists, under helmets, burning flesh with no escape. It didn't look deadly from a distance. Up close, it was pure agony. Gravity was another silent ally. Defenders dropped massive stones, logs, or even carcasses from above, not just to kill but to disrupt. Siege engines were smashed, formations scattered, confidence shattered. The simplest of weapons became moments of pure chaos. And then there were the traps. Collapsing bridge timed just right. A pit of sharpened stakes hidden beneath weeds. A false wall that crumbled to reveal an even stronger barrier behind it. Each one was designed to punish not just the body, but the mind, to make every step feel like a mistake. In siege defense, doubt was a weapon. But the most effective tactic? Time. The longer a siege dragged on, the weaker the attackers became. Food ran out. Sickness spread through their camps. Morale dropped. The defenders knew. Every day they held the wall was a day closer to relief or to watching the enemy retreat. In that space of waiting, of enduring, creativity flourished. Terrain became a weapon. Unity became a shield. And time, stretched thin and sharp, became a sword. But if the defenders wielded patience and trickery, the attackers held something far more chilling: fear, and they knew exactly how to use it. In siege warfare, not all weapons were made of wood, iron, or fire. Some were made of silence, of spectacle, of fear. The greatest generals and engineers of the ancient world knew this. Before you break the wall, you must break the will. And so, alongside trebuchets and battering rams, they built something far more powerful: terror. Siege warfare was not just about destruction. It was about domination. And psychological warfare was its most refined art. Every machine, every tower, every groaning wheel was more than a tool. It was a monument to power. They were built tall to make defenders feel small. They were made heavy to signal unstoppable force. They creaked and roared to drown out hope. The message was clear: resistance is useless. In this theater of dread, the enemy didn't just hear your advance. They felt it in their bones. The Assyrians mastered this early on. They would drag their siege machines across open desert, letting them be seen for miles. No need to fire a shot. Just the sight of these juggernauts moving steadily forward was enough to unnerve entire garrisons. The Romans took it further. They didn't sneak up on cities. They built their siege camps right in front of them, bold, organized, and relentless. From the ramparts, defenders would watch, day after day, as machines were assembled, weapons tested, formations drilled. It was war as theater, an open-air performance meant to shatter confidence, not walls. And then came the messages, flung not with ink, but with blood. Trebuchets didn't just throw stone. They hurled corpses, diseased bodies meant to spread plague, severed heads of generals, mangled remains of envoys still wearing their armor. Every payload was a sentence. No one is coming. Your fate is sealed. These were curses given weight, horror wrapped in velocity. Even the sounds were weaponized. The rhythmic pounding of a ram against a gate became a doomsday clock. The stretching twang of tensioned ropes, a whisper that death was near. But sometimes the most chilling sound was silence. When no arrows flew, no drums beat, only stillness remained. And in that quiet, fear grew louder than any battle cry. Because in the end, the strongest walls were not made of stone. They were made of resolve. And when that cracked, when defenders believed no one would save them, when they thought even the gods had turned away, then the gates opened long before the enemy arrived. The best sieges ended not with a sword, but with surrender of the soul. But even that form of warfare would soon be eclipsed, because when the first cannon fired, the age of stone and spirit gave way to fire and thunder. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the age of siege engines, trebuchets, rams, towers was drawing its final breath. Gunpowder had arrived, and with it, the cannon. No longer did armies need hours of pendulum strikes or days of rolling towers. A well-aimed cannonball could do in seconds what trebuchets took hours to accomplish. The giants of wood and rope were retired to history, their roar replaced by the thunder of metal and flame. And so the walls fell. The mighty stone fortresses, once invincible, became liabilities. Constantinople, once the model of impenetrability, collapsed under the force of Ottoman bombardment. Across Europe, castles that had stood for centuries crumbled under fire. And with it, a new kind of fortress was born. Lower, angled, designed not to resist rams, but to absorb and deflect cannon fire, the Star Fort. But the physics remained. Trajectory, torsion, counterweight, all still lived in the math behind modern artillery. Missiles, rockets, ballistic shells, they are just trebuchets in steel armor, burning chemical fire instead of muscle and gravity. The heart of siege warfare never died. It just evolved. And so did psychological warfare. Today's sieges don't always come with stone and fire. They come with silence, firewalls, information blackouts, social isolation. The aim is still the same: to isolate, to drain, to break you from within. The new walls aren't made of stone. They're digital, economic, invisible. Yet the nature of siege is eternal. One side wants in. One side must hold. That tension, the pressure, the countdown, the slow crush, is the soul of every conflict. And though the trebuchet may rest in museums, the siege lives on. Because sometimes walls don't fall from impact. Sometimes they crumble from silence, from isolation, from being left alone too long.